Okay, thank you for joining us today. Kumar Garg couldn't make it today, so I'll be facilitating this conversation. My name is Janessa Peterson, and I work as Director of Learning Engineering at the Learning Agency. We're really excited today to welcome Aly Murray, who is the founder and executive director of UPchieve. She's here today to have an informal conversation with us about her experiences with several accelerator programs. UPchieve is an edtech nonprofit that provides free 24/7 online tutoring to low-income high school students. Using their app, students can request and get paired with a live volunteer tutor in under 5 minutes. So far, they've matched more than 35,000 on-demand tutoring requests from more than 8,000 students in all 50 states. And their work has been recognized by Forbes and TIME, and their funders include the Gates Foundation. And to get where they are today, UPchieve has participated in 6 different accelerator programs: Y Combinator, Acumen Civic Accelerator, Visible Connect, AT&T Aspire, Blue Ridge Labs at Robinhood, and Fast Forward. So Aly's here today to share a bit about that journey and to answer your questions about accelerator programs from her experience perspective. Before we start off, please take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat with your name and your organization. And also please feel free to start posting your questions in the chat. After a short presentation, we'll open it up to the questions, and we'll try to get through as many of the questions as we can. You should know that we'll prioritize the questions received in the chat, but we'll also try to get through as many of the questions as possible from those of you who may have submitted those questions when you registered. If you really want your question answered though, feel free to post it again in the chat. We may call on you to ask your question out loud. And if we don't get to your question during the call, we'll circle back with you after. Also, please note that this session is being recorded, and we'll share this recording with those who are unable to make it here today. If you'd like to watch the recording yourself, feel free to email me and I'll put my email in the chat. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Aly Murray. Aly, could you tell us a bit about UPchieve and your accelerator journey?
Absolutely. I'm really excited to be here today. Thank you to all of you who are here and interested in our journey. So as Janessa mentioned, I'm the founder and executive director of UPchieve, and we are an edtech nonprofit that's working to democratize access to academic support. More practically, what we do is we've built this free online platform that allows students to connect with a live tutor in just 5 minutes. And so we didn't start on day one doing that, but we've had quite the journey. So I actually was a former low-income student myself, which is why I started doing this. And then I actually left my job at JP Morgan to start working at UPchieve full-time about 3 years ago. And so that whole journey for me working on UPchieve full-time really kicked off with an accelerator program. And so accelerator programs have been really fundamental to our experience to getting to where we are today. I have a simple slide here for you all that will kind of visually show you what our journey has looked like. Give me 1 second to pull that up. So this is actually the kind of chronological order of accelerator programs that we've been through. So in summer 2018, that's when I first quit my job to work on UPchieve. For those of you who are here listening from the perspective of you've started your own thing and you want to scale it, and you, or maybe you haven't quit your job yet, but you're thinking about it. That's where we were at the very beginning of this blue line. I had just quit my job. I knew that UPchieve was the thing that I cared so much about building from my own personal experiences, and we'd had some very early traction, but we hadn't raised a single dollar. So our very, very first check was actually funding from an accelerator program, from Fast Forward in particular. And so that alone should give you a sense of how important these accelerator programs have been for us. In that first year of working on UPchieve, we actually participated in 3 different accelerator programs. So starting with Fast Forward, We then went through the Blue Ridge Labs program at Robinhood, which is, I'll give a quick overview of what each of these are. So Fast Forward focuses on supporting tech nonprofits specifically. So if you are an edtech nonprofit, you're eligible for that program. Blue Ridge Labs works with both for-profits and nonprofits, so social enterprises working to improve the lives of low-income New Yorkers. So that one does require you to be based in New York. You can be a national initiative. We were still working with students in other places, but we are based in Brooklyn, so we are eligible for that program. AT&T Aspire Accelerator is an edtech accelerator, definitely has a focus on impact, but they accept both for-profits and nonprofits. They actually take more for-profits than nonprofits in every cycle. The Civic Accelerator program, another one focused on tech impact more broadly. They take both for-profits and nonprofits. Visible Connect was a tech nonprofit, and in particular, mobile tech nonprofit accelerator. And then finally, the one that I assume most people may be even most familiar with, we actually went through Y Combinator at the beginning of this year, which is one of the most well-known tech startup accelerators. They do take edtech startups in that program. They take very few nonprofits, and if people are specifically curious about that, I can talk about that later on. But they really primarily focus on for-profit tech startups. So this was our journey, and just to recap, we started here at the beginning of the timeline in summer 2018, not having raised any money. And even by the time we were finishing Blue Ridge Labs, we had raised less than 100K. And so early on, these accelerators were crucial to us really being able to get the funding we needed to start hiring full-time staff and growing what we do. I remember a moment for us between Blue Ridge Labs and the AT&T Aspire Accelerator where we didn't know if we were going to get into this Aspire Accelerator. And I had two versions of my budget. There were two tabs. One was called UPchieve Budget, and the other tab was called UPchieve Budget if Aly not paid. And so this was, for us to give some context, we were very early stage. And I remember at that stage, getting into these accelerators really felt like a huge difference. It was really binary. It's like either we got in, it was great, or we didn't get in and we were going to be in big trouble. By the time we were starting to do the Civic Accelerator and the Visible Connect Accelerator, we were still pretty early stage. We had raised less than $1 million by the end of those programs, or right around these programs. So we reached $1 million in funding, I believe, towards the end of Visible Connect. So things started to speed up a lot for us after AT&T Aspire. But we're still really pretty early stage, and there are a lot of funders that are more hesitant about you when you're early stage. And then by the time we got to Y Combinator by the end of that program, so in current today, we've raised more than $2.5 million. And so to give you a sense of how we've kind of grown, and that's kind of my high level overview. I'd much rather spend time answering people's questions. I know there were a lot of questions submitted before the event. And so I'm happy to start digging into questions.
What a crazy story. You were at that point where you were trying to decide if you're going to be able to be paid. That's great though, that you were determined to make it work, whether you were paid or not.
Yeah.
Yeah. How exciting. Huh? And congratulations on where you're at right now. You've really come a long way.
Yeah, from $0 in fundraising, right, to almost 3 million. It's definitely been a lot of growth pretty quickly over the last 3 years. So, yeah.
Yeah, excellent. So the first question I want to get to is a question from somebody. It's a pre-submitted question, but I believe this person is here. Chris Hopkins, are you here? Would you like to ask your question? Yeah, if you're not here, Chris, it's okay. The question I think is really good though. What do you wish you had done prior to attending an accelerator, even the first one?
Yeah, for sure. I do think that, so for example, that very first accelerator we went through, in some ways, I think we weren't even ready for it to get as much of the value out of it as possible. one of the things that I wasn't prepared for and wish I had been more prepared for in that program, and then even in all kind of subsequent accelerators, is being able to really take advantage of the connections I was going to make. So there were a lot of people that I met during the earlier accelerators in particular that I lost contact with and I never followed up with because I was completely overwhelmed by the number of people that I was meeting and didn't have any sort of organizational system to keep track of them. And so in a way, I do think, that is something that I wish I had realized just how intense that would be and had a better game plan for making sure I utilized all those connections. I do think it's possible to be too early for an accelerator. You might still get the funding out of the program, but some of the other things that the program provides, you might not be able to take full advantage of. And so with that first accelerator, they were making introductions to people who could write checks for UPchieve someday, but we were actually in some cases a little too early for those conversations.
That's interesting. That actually leads into one of the other questions. 2 or 3 people asked this before this event. The question is, when is a good time to start looking into accelerators? What place should you be at with your organization before you do that?
Yeah, so it's going to be different for every accelerator program. So a lot of accelerator programs have a very target stage. I will say in my experience, most of them want to see some early traction. It is really hard to get into an accelerator program, not impossible, but really hard if all you have is an idea. The more progress that you can make and show, even before you've sometimes, unfortunately, even before you've raised any funding, the better. And so I think even as small as like 10, 50, 100 users can go a really long way to being able to tell your story about the impact that your product is going to have. And so I do think that that's where I think you're starting to be ready for most accelerator programs. Typically you have to have some users. And then for certain programs, they're going to be looking for more than just a few users. They may be starting to look for more like in-depth proof of impact. They might be looking for more proof of your business model being successful, right? Your revenue. They're going to want to see some sort of traction in revenue. And so it does depend on the accelerator. And that's something you can typically find on their website. A lot of them specifically define stages and say, this is our stage. This is where we want you to be to go through the program. Yeah.
That's interesting. So a lot of them have stages. What other qualifications or qualities do you think make a good applicant for a program?
To be a strong applicant for a program, I think that a lot of it actually comes through being able to communicate clearly about your vision and what you're trying to do with the for-profit or the nonprofit that you're starting. And I think that actually the best way to get good at that is to start applying to things. I did not get into the very first program that we applied to, and several of the accelerators that we went through, we had to apply multiple times before we got in. So for example, Fast Forward, we applied to multiple times. Visible Connect, we had to apply to, we got in on the second time. Y Combinator, we actually applied, I believe, 3 times before we got in. And that's not even on the high end of sometimes how many times people have to apply to get into Y Combinator. And so I do think that every time you apply to a program, you are getting better and better, especially if you manage to get feedback from people. You're getting better and better at telling your story. Every time you do an interview, anytime you pitch your organization, full stop, you're just getting like better at being able to communicate clearly what it is you're doing. Yeah.
So then would you recommend applying to as many accelerators as it takes to get in?
I do think at a certain point, you maybe want to stop and ask yourself and other people, like if you're not having any success and you've been applying to multiple programs, it is really important to get that feedback and seek it out, because maybe you still haven't figured out the right way to communicate it, or there are other things. You need to definitely understand what is it that people are most skeptical about. But I do think that a compelling vision and being able to communicate it clearly goes a long way for accelerator programs. And then the final thing I actually didn't mention in the last question is you as a founder being able to tell a very convincing story about why you care and why you're the right person is really important as well.
That's interesting. That just makes me think of one more question before we leave this topic. What did you think of the feedback that you got from the accelerators when you either were accepted or not accepted? You know, was it helpful, or do you feel like you're kind of in the dark about whether or not your proposal was good?
Right. I think that the default for a lot of programs is they won't give you feedback. And so I do think that it really pays to ask for that feedback, even if you get into a program, right? Like, I think that I love asking funders and accelerator programs and just about anybody I talk to, like, what do you like? What don't you like? What don't you believe, right? Where are you skeptical? Because that's just, I think, incredibly useful for future conversations. I think that in the cases where you do get the feedback, sometimes you can be really surprised. That's actually, in some cases, like some of the best feedback, because if you had no idea, then there's no way you could have improved on it. And then sometimes you get feedback. I remember one piece of feedback I got actually during one of the first accelerator programs I ever did, where we weren't working with that many users. And I was like, oh, well, we're going to do these things and we're going to do that thing. And like, we're improving. And the feedback I got was like, no, the most important thing you need to do is go get users. And like, you don't have anything until you've worked with more students. And so that kind of real talk feedback was really, really like tough love feedback, right? That's actually the hardest to hear, but the most important to seek out. So that like you've gotten good feedback when it's hard to hear. Sure.
Like that, you've gotten good feedback when it's hard to hear. Yeah. That's great. Okay, so this next question is from the chat. Is Nick Jenkins here?
Yes, I am here.
Hi, Nick. Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, sure. And thank you, Aly, for the time. I appreciate it. My core question to you is, after applying to so many programs, are you starting these programs with the same objective in mind, or is there like a common theme of what you're hoping to get out of these programs as a result of applying and going through them?
Yeah.
Other, perhaps than capital.
Right. Yeah. And I will say that for us, as an early stage organization with like limited connections and other sources of funding, I don't think it's a problem to do. I don't think it's necessarily a problem if your primary reason for doing an accelerator is the funding. Like, it is a really great source of early stage funding. And you can be, if you're early stage enough, you can be at a point where you're so early stage that really almost nothing else is available to you. And so that is in and of itself a good enough reason, I think, to do an accelerator program and got UPchieve very far. It's also credibility building, right? So I often like to think of early stage funding. I run a nonprofit, and so some of this may be more nonprofit specific, but I think it applies at least a little bit on the for-profit side. So most people have heard of like the product adoption curve. Essentially a curve that shows like the people who will try out your product when you're really new, or like there's very few of them, right? They're true like innovators, they're really adventurous. And then as you kind of move along that curve, the barrier to like people wanting the amount of like, you're less risky, right? So there are more people who are willing to try your product. Well, that same thing applies with funders. And so at an early stage, the kinds of people who will give you funding have to be really willing to take on risk. And those are often accelerator programs. So I do think that in and of itself is a pretty good reason to do a program. The thing that you have to think about, if one of your primary goals is funding, is how time intensive is this program? How much time on a weekly basis am I going to put into this? And is it distracting me from something that's even more important than funding at this stage? So I do think that like to participate in a program where there's no funding involved, and there are accelerator programs where they don't give you any funding, or in fact, they actually want you to pay to participate in the program. Those are the ones where I'm like, you have to have such a clear idea of what you're hoping to learn and get out of the program for that to be worth it, because you are investing time with no financial gain. But as long as for a program where they're actually giving you grant funding or they're investing in your startup, I think that the trade-off is typically a lot easier. Most of the programs are not that time intensive. Hopefully that was helpful. Yeah. Did that address your question, Nick?
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you.
Yep.
That actually, that's interesting. It kind of relates to this next question, which Aly, you had said you probably wouldn't be able to talk much about equity and these kinds of things. But I wonder, this person said, if you could talk about it, did you have to offer equity or profit sharing to accelerators? The question essentially, I think, is what do you have to offer or show in order to be accepted? And in profit, and also how is that different from a for-profit and a nonprofit applicant?
Yeah, for sure. So, so as a nonprofit, we don't even have equity, so we can't even give it to somebody if they wanted it. So that is a little different for a nonprofit versus a for-profit. I have been through 4 programs. 4 of the 6 programs also took both for-profits and nonprofits. 3 of the 6 expected equity in return for you going through the program. And so, like, I am familiar a little bit, at least, with the concept. So if you are a for-profit, most accelerator programs are going to, like, a lot of them will be looking for you to give up equity in return for the investment that they're making. It's it actually is an investment. That being said, the terms tend to be really favorable because they want the whole point of the accelerator program. They need you to be successful to make any return anyway. And so, you know, they're trying to give you favorable terms that help you really, like, get up and running with your organization. So when I've talked to my fellow for-profit participants in those programs, generally I've heard that the terms are more than worth it. So yes, if you're a for-profit, most programs will expect you to give equity. However, if you're at the stage where you really need those early checks and you have a lot of learning to do, it may very well be worth it. So that's what I would share. I'm not familiar with profit sharing in the context of an accelerator. That's not something that I have come across. But I will say one final thing. There are some programs that accept for-profits and just give grants, even though it's for for-profits. Those tend to be highly impact-focused accelerators. So if you're running a for-profit, but you are planning to have a big impact, like social impact through your work, there are some programs specifically for companies like yours where they're going to give you a grant and you actually don't need to give any equity.
That's neat. Oh, that's great. Yeah, interesting. Okay, so this next one is from the chat. Is Gabriel Stobe? Sorry, Gabriel Stobe. Are you here? Oh, I can see your face, but you can't hear you're muted.
Mute. Okay. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Yeah. I hear a lot about funding, but what do you have actually students already?
Yeah, so we're approaching 10,000 students. So we've worked with a lot of students. The students are not our clients. And I thought what you might be asking about is how did the programs help us grow our revenue? Is that one of the things you were wondering about, or?
No, I'm just wondering, what is your quality control for your tutors?
Oh, sure. I'm happy to talk about that. Yeah. So as you know, I mentioned, we pair low-income high school students can use our platform and connect with live tutors. All of the tutors are volunteers, but they go through a pretty lengthy screening, approval, training, and onboarding process. So they're providing proof of their identity. They're providing references. They're passing certification quizzes in every subject that they want to tutor. And we have kind of an in-depth, like, quality control process where both students and volunteers provide feedback after every session, which we monitor, and we review sessions as well, and share feedback back with the volunteers. So we have a lot that we do on the volunteer side to ensure that we're providing high quality support.
So what is when you say some extra classes or some extra training, could you describe that? What kind of training would they take to really become efficient tutors?
Yeah, so there's 2 dimensions to that. One is making sure that the volunteer has the subject matter knowledge, which means that if they're tutoring Algebra 1, they themselves can do Algebra 1, right? And so that we can verify through our certification quiz, essentially giving them an Algebra 1 test. And then the other part that's really important, the other big part, there's other things that matter, but the other big part of being a good tutor is making sure that they have tutoring skills, so they understand what it means to be a good tutor and what tools are in their toolbox. So things like asking lots of questions, right? Giving them checks to see if they're understanding, figuring out ways to kind of engage them in dialogue. And so there's a set of skills that we've actually just more recently started to develop trainings around, and helping volunteers develop those skills through courses in our platform.
So I'm basically interested. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, we need to cut that off just for now, because we have to keep going with all the questions.
Oh, sure.
Gabrielle, thank you so much for your question.
Oh yeah, thank you, appreciate it.
And I appreciate that you brought up such an interesting point about UPchieve. UPchieve has done such amazing work. One of the things I find really inspiring about your organization is just the sheer number of both volunteers who are volunteering to help for free, and all the students that you've been able to help. It's really exciting and impressive what you've done so far.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So so we have another question from the chat. Is Hushel here? Hushel? If you are speaking, we can't hear you, so I'll just read your question. The question was, what's the most valuable thing you got from Y Combinator?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have to say, because it's the most recent program we went through, I feel like I had experience and did get a lot out of it, but it's also very unique among the other programs that we participated in, and that it's really designed for for-profits. And while they might take 1 to 3 nonprofits per batch, that's with like 300 like for-profits. And so it is really for-profit focused. But I actually think that was really valuable as a nonprofit to be forced to, challenged to think in a different way. And I do think that, especially as a tech nonprofit, we're in some ways more like a tech startup than we are like a traditional nonprofit. And so I do think it was really valuable to be challenged to think more like a for-profit and to focus on how we could grow our revenue strategy. So I think that Y Combinator in particular is really good at helping startups figure out their revenue strategy and really like continue to iterate to get to the thing that works. So I feel like that was true even for us as a nonprofit in the program. We do have a few revenue strategies and we're able to work on improving those. We actually also, even as a nonprofit, had a lot of success with Demo Day, and we're able to meet angel investors who ended up donating their typical angel investment size. And so that was really, really valuable to our organization as well.
That's interesting. Yeah, I know there's a lot of questions. We'll probably get to several of them about just differentiating. How do you tell, what's value about this accelerator versus this other accelerator? Obviously, there's a lot of difference. So we'll hopefully get to some of those questions in just a bit here. But I want to address another question from the chat. This one's from Nick Jenkins. Nick, would you like to ask your question? Okay, I will read it I'll read it for him here. So the question is, would you go through yet another accelerator program at this point? Why or why not? That's a good question.
Yeah, I would consider it. I think that the bar gets higher because there's a series of things, right? Like the things that I feel we need to learn about right now to do well, there's fewer of those topics that I'm like, for some accelerators we've gone through in the past, one of the early ones we went through was called Blue Ridge Labs, and they have a focus on user research and impact measurement. At the time that I went through that program, I didn't know anything about user research. I had never really done a formal user interview or a focus group. And so that was invaluable. So there was something very specific I needed to learn from that program. Now we have a lot of exposure to some of the fundamental skills that I think an edtech startup should have. And so there's less likely a topic in terms of the information that we'd want to learn. And then I think that in terms of the funding, the size checks that we would invest time into pursuing has also gotten bigger, if that makes sense. And so I think that for many accelerator programs, they're really most valuable at an early stage. So we would definitely consider it. And I think that it's really a combination of those two things is how I evaluate the programs, is one, the amount of funding versus the amount of time required. And then two, like, what can I point to specifically and say that like that would help advance the organization that's worth investing the time. And so it could be a specific thing that I need to learn about. It could be a network. So for example, one type of program that I'd be really interested in still would be a program that would help us work even more closely with schools and doing research. And so that's something that could be interest. Or if we were developing a new program or trying to go a different direction, like there could definitely be valid reasons why we might want to do a program that would help us explore that idea or bring in extra funding. Yeah.
So it sounds like it's not just any accelerator program. You're really, what would make you choose to do an accelerator program is what that program specifically has to offer for you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a good point. Why don't we talk just a little bit about that? There's quite a few questions about how you do tell the differences between accelerator programs and also how you find the one that's right for you. Do you have any suggestions about that?
Could you repeat that? Sorry.
How do you evaluate the differences between the accelerator programs, and how do you even locate the one that's right for you?
Right. Yeah. So I do think that a lot of the programs that I participated in, I actually found through newsletters that were, that are about the impact space. So I specifically was looking for programs, accelerator programs that accepted nonprofits, because not all of them do, and that had an impact focus. And so, we've been through a few different programs now. And so you have to figure out, well, do I have a strong enough impact play? Do I want to look at impact related accelerators? Am I edtech? And like, I don't think I can get into any other types of programs. So there are newsletters you can join that kind of gather those resources. One that I really like, actually Fast Forward has a newsletter of funding opportunities that they send out every week. And so that's an example of a newsletter that I really like, and helped us find a lot of programs actually. And then in terms of differentiating, like say you found some programs and you're trying to decide if it's worth doing, you definitely want to ask, or usually, hopefully you can get a sense through the website, but you want to definitely in an interview, you want to understand how many hours a week do they expect the program will require you to invest? How many times do you have to meet in person? Those tend to be really time intensive. If you have to go every week and be there in person for a full day or two, that's a really big time investment versus a program where once every month you go for a day or two, that's less time intensive. So I do think as a general statement, you should look for potentially less time intensive programs. And I think that's one of the things that I would kind of call out. And then most of the sites will tell you, these are our specific things that we want to teach you about during the program. And so if you don't feel like you have anything to learn in any of the things that they want to teach you about, not only is it maybe not worth your time, depending on how much you need the funding and how much time it is, but that program is also less likely to accept you. We've been rejected from programs because they didn't feel like they had anything left that they could teach us. We were too far along. And so that will happen. It's not just you deciding if it's right for you. They're going to decide if they think you're right for them. And one of the things they'll look at is, do they have something they can teach you?
How interesting that they thought you already knew too much, essentially, in those instances. That's yeah. Really interesting. Yeah. Okay, so this next question is from the chat. Anindya?
Yes, that's correct.
Great, go ahead.
So I think, so thank you for this AMA. It's a wonderful journey and what you're doing is amazing. I really like this. So I think you already mentioned that being part of the accelerators that helped prove your credibility to your clients, which could be the school systems or other places where you who come up. Would you say that these accelerators also directly helped you in networking, or like, bringing you clients, or not necessarily bringing you clients, but, putting you in touch with people who might be interested?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think speaking about the one edtech specific program we did, AT&T Aspire, just to give a concrete example, one of the parts of their program is they actually bring you to an edtech conference. And if you're a small startup, there's a chance you've never been to a conference before because they're really expensive. And so they pay for you to go to this conference, and they even give you a booth where you're on the expo floor. And that for us was really game changing because we got to talk to tons and tons of teachers and schools. And so that was like a very real, way that an accelerator program helped us increase and improve or expand our network. Many programs have built-in kind of like mentorship and networking. There's different models for that, but I do think there's something to be said for sheer quantity. So one of the things that's unique about the Fast Forward program is they have these, it's almost like speed dating, but with like mentor type people. And so you're meeting just a huge number of people. And there's a really great chance you're going to meet somebody where what you're doing really resonates with them. They might be a funder, they may have a connection to a school, to a potential customer or partner. And so I do think that programs that specifically build in networking opportunities are valuable. And I personally think like the quantity does matter. And because you just never know, like I've been surprised how some of the programs or random people I've met during programs have led to really important partnerships or things like that.
That's amazing. Thank you.
Absolutely.
That sounds like fun too. Was it fun?
Yeah, it was fun. It can be a little exhausting as well, but, and I think the one thing I will say, it can sometimes feel really, this is actually super true, I think, of accelerator programs, not just for me, but other people who I've talked to that have gone through them. It can sometimes feel really discouraging if you're in a program and you have a ton of these like mentorship or like networking type conversations, and none of them feel like they're a fit. But you can't really fully predict when one of the people you're talking to could be a donor. They could know someone they can introduce you to partner. And then the other thing is that every single conversation you have during an accelerator program, whether you realize it or not, you're getting a lot better at pitching what you do. You're getting a lot better at public speaking more generally. And I think that, I just actually think that practice is really invaluable especially for early stage founders.
Good perspective. Yeah. So this next question was submitted in advance, but I think that he's here. Joss, are you here? Joss, I'll let you expand on this question if you'd like. The question is, what is missing from accelerators in the edtech space? And what would be most helpful if someone was building a new edtech accelerator?
I think this is a great question. I'm not sure if Joss, did you take yourself off mute? Go ahead, Joss, if you're there and you want to expand.
Hey, yeah, I'm here. In fact, I'll just, so you can see my face. How's it going? Pleasure to meet you. Really enjoying this session. I think, I've been an edtech founder in the past, and now I'm working with Schmidt Futures on the learning engineering team. And one of the common threads we see with edtech organizations is, hey, we'd love an accelerator that helps with distribution or something else.
Yeah.
And so I'm just wondering from your experience, what would be most useful for accelerators today if they were focused just on the edtech space?
Yeah, I think within the edtech space, it's interesting because it's hard to generalize across all edtech startups. I can say that there's a subset of edtech startups where what they really need is more direct connections, introductions, exposure to schools and districts and teachers and people within the educators, right? I do think that maybe I can imagine there are some startups that maybe they don't need that. Maybe they are the former teacher and they, have gotten all their friends to try it. But I do think that the reason I say that I think that's important is selling to schools is notoriously hard. And it's a thing that I think a lot of edtech startups really struggle with. And so I think it's important to have those really close connections to the educators that you're working with. For user research, for example, that's a thing that I haven't seen or hasn't been a part of any of my programs, is the ability to actually specifically do user research. Or the Blue Ridge Labs program that I went through, they had this focus on user research, but within their like base of people that you could do user research with were all low-income New Yorkers. And so I'm imagining something like that, but for educators. And I think that could be incredibly powerful, because I do think that's important. And so that's an example of something. And then I think the other thing I would call out, I think there's one program that does something like this that I know of, but I think there should be way more, is around impact and research. Because long term, I think a lot of edtech startups have to be able to show the efficacy of their work, but it can be extremely hard to get started on doing any sort of research or study, even just as simple as a case study. And so programs are like support and doing that, I think is really key for, that's probably like not the earliest stage, but it's like you already have traction, people are using it and they like it. And now to get to the next stage of being able to scale, you really need to be able to prove your efficacy. So it's still early stage, but like a little later, if that makes sense.
Got it. Thanks for answering the question.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the next question is from someone in the chat. Yo Ying, are you here? Okay, Yo Ying, I'll read your question then. So the question says, is the accelerator programs for STEM education startups or for any startups? So that kind of relates to Joss's question about, what are the differences between edtech accelerators and a general accelerator? And are there specific focuses within an accelerator program that you might want to be aware of?
Yeah, so I've seen accelerator programs for tons and tons of different types of startups. I think that there are a lot of like nonprofit specific ones. There's a lot of tech startup, broadly any type of tech startup accelerator programs. And then I would say there's a few different programs that are like civic tech or ed tech or like work tech. And like there's, so there's a few programs that are specific. And so I think that if you were looking for a program, you could try to think of the most like narrow version and like slowly widen, like write out all the things that your startup could be classified as, and like widen from the most narrow definition of what you do and see if there are programs specific to that, because there's a decent number of different programs. I put our website there, and I think you may have been asking about the programs we've been through. You can see a list of them. Well, you can find the links to all of their websites on our supporters page. They're not in any specific order. They're mixed with other like philanthropic funders, but they're all there on that page. So hopefully that's helpful.
Thank you.
So this next question is from Richard Tang. Richard, you submitted a question beforehand. I don't know if you remember this, but I think it's actually a really good question. I'll read the question and let you expand if you'd like. You wanted to know about the costs and benefits of joining an accelerator program versus other types of investments, such as grants or venture capital, et cetera. What do you think about that, Aly?
Yeah, absolutely. I thought this was a great question. I do think that the costs are really, depends on the type of program. So if you're a for-profit and you're giving up equity, then like that's a very real cost. But I do think that even if it's a program where you don't have to give equity and it's a grant, they're just giving you cash, right? And so like if it's an actual cost, either you're giving equity or you're paying to go through the program, that makes the bar really high. And then if it's even a grant program, I think the cost is really your time and the potential distraction from work. If you already know exactly what you need to be doing and you could just put your head down and work, then there's a potential it's possible that that is what you should be doing at that point in time, right? So that's something that is a very personal thing for you to figure out. If like, should you be putting your head down and working, or should you be like potentially distracting yourself to go through the program? But I think that, and I talked about this a little bit, like it depends on how hard it is for you to raise money. Like, right, there are certain stages where it's almost impossible to get any other type of check, in which case I think like the trade-off is usually worth it if it's for free money, grant money, to go through the program. Richard, did you want to expand on that at all? I see you're there now, and I don't know if I answered your question.
Yeah, super helpful. I guess I think you answered it pretty well. I don't have any follow-up, but thank you for sharing.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You've mentioned it several times that the time that you have to put into the program is a major consideration.
Yeah.
I think that's a really interesting thing to know, an insider's perspective on that. So thank you.
Yeah. I think that a lot of programs, and I know there are some people in the audience who are thinking about building accelerator programs as well. And so I think this is relevant to people considering building and people considering participating. But a lot of programs really believe that their curriculum, the things they're going to teach you how to do, are like so invaluable. And I think they can be if you've done a really good job picking the exact right program. But I also believe that, like, for most people, like, I'm not sure it's really possible to teach how to be successful at running a startup. Like, I think that there are skills that can be useful, but really, like, getting your hands dirty and trying to do the work is probably the best teacher. And so I do think that, like, it's helpful. The curriculum is always, at least in my experience so far, I've always found the speakers and the curriculum and the exercises, I've always found them at least somewhat helpful. But I do think that, I also don't think you should go into a program assuming that they can teach you how to be successful. They can equip you with skills and they can expand your network and they can give you funding, but I don't think there's such a thing as being able to teach, how to be successful. It's a lot of trial and error for sure. Yeah.
That's funny. That actually leads me to a question that was asked, I would guess, by 4 or 5 people in advance, which is, are there any choices that you made with UPchieve that you really think you probably wouldn't have made if you hadn't been involved in these accelerator programs? So in other words, how did these programs shape UPchieve?
Yeah, I love this question. An example of this is sometimes they accelerated what I thought was possible. Like, they made me try to do a thing earlier than I would have otherwise. And so a great example I mentioned with AT&T Aspire, they brought us to a conference and they had us in the expo hall. We didn't have a single school partner. We had only exclusively partnered with nonprofits up to that point, but we wanted to work with school partners. We thought we were nowhere near ready. We thought it would be a whole nother year before we could work with schools, but being in that expo hall and talking to teachers and administrators about our work, we naturally, like, by the, a few months later, we had our first 5 school partners. And so that's an example of, being kind of encouraged to do something faster than we might have otherwise. And I think I can point to different, like, in almost every single program, there was something that they made us think about or try to do probably earlier than we would have otherwise. The first program I mentioned really pushed us to perfect our pitch and to focus on, getting more users. And we were like, oh, we don't need to worry too much about getting more users. We're still figuring all these things out. And they're like, no, you do need users. That's the very best way to learn about if what you're doing works in your product. And so that was an important push. And so I do think there's been a few really great things that the programs have helped us do.
That's great to hear. Inspiring too. So there was another question. Let's see. Neil, are you present? There's a question you offered in your registration form. Would you like to expand on that?
Yeah, I actually don't remember what that question was.
Let me read it and then you can expand if you'd like. The question was, what are the most common needs met by EdTech accelerators? And what's the procurement and timeline setting and per district knowledge? That's the most important stuff that you're looking into with your, I know that you're working with your Recap CS, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then also, your other question was, did you pay to join any of the accelerators?
Yeah, so we've done a lot of, I guess you could call it customer discovery and product design and development, and all that stuff is like relatively easy. It's more of a function of time, and I'm a software engineer by trade. My co-founder is a designer, so I think our skill sets are good for product development. But as far as edtech specifically goes, there's a lot of opportunity out there. There's a lot of change in the space. And I'm wondering, maybe you talked about this earlier, but as far as like vetting accelerators or vetting programs, what do you look for? Is it the value add, the very explicit value add that they state, or are there like things that especially come to mind, especially for someone like we have like 2 teachers who say they want to work with us right now, and honestly that feels like dumb luck. So I guess I'm looking for like patterns with regard to growing our business.
Yeah. Well, congratulations on the 2 teachers. And I would say that all early customers and users are essentially like dumb luck. And I can tell you, I don't feel like I've almost pretty much every new thing we've done or new customer or new revenue, it's been like kind of pure luck, right? So the first ones are, and then you hopefully learn from every subsequent customer and you're like, oh, okay, this is the strategy. These are the people we're targeting and this is why they're purchasing it. But the first few, it's like, what, you do want to give us money to do this thing? So you're right where you should be. And then I'd say that for that particular stage, so you're past the very earliest of accelerators. The very earliest of accelerators are going to help you clarify your vision. They're going to help you learn about your users. They're going to teach you, how to pitch. And it sounds like you maybe are like moving past that now into like, okay, now like let's get into the details of how do I build this revenue strategy and how do I make this replicable and get more and more customers. So I do think that I just wanted to call that out, that it's not the very, like, you're going to see programs that are like, they're going to teach you the very, very basics, and you don't need that anymore. And I will say that if you're having trouble with funding, that doesn't mean that you can't necessarily go through the program. You're going to get a lot out of the network, maybe, right? And the introductions they can make. So you have to do what's right for your funding. So like, I wouldn't say you shouldn't do those at all, but they're not going to teach you the things that you're most interested in learning right now. This is a little bit of what I was saying, I think is missing in the space for, I think, Jazz's question, the stuff that you called out around procurement, timeline, per district knowledge. Like most programs are not doing this, but I would say based off of those things you mentioned, you definitely want to look at edtech specific accelerators as opposed to like a more general like tech accelerator. The one exception I'll call out is I do think Combinator is something you could look at, because they really, even if they're not an expert on edtech per se, they've worked with lots of edtech companies before. So maybe they're not edtech specific, but in particular, the group partners are really, really knowledgeable and have seen every type of company and every type of business model. And I think that, are you a for-profit or nonprofit?
We're a for-profit.
For-profit. Okay. The bar is actually easier to get in as a for-profit. What I mean by that is like the amount of revenue you need to have generated already is typically lower. It certainly helps. The more revenue you can say you've already generated, that'll help. But as a nonprofit, in case there are any nonprofit people on the call, I would say it's almost impossible I've been told it's pretty much impossible by people who work at Y Combinator to get in as a nonprofit if you don't have revenue yet. But so like that's an example of a general tech that I still think would help you, because they're going to learn a ton about your specific model and give you really in-depth advice. So I didn't fully answer your question. I think it's hard to find that in an accelerator program. Most of them aren't doing that. You should look at edtech specific ones, and then Y Combinator as well, I think could help there. And honestly, like, keep experimenting. It may seem like dumb luck, but you will learn. You may honestly still learn more from your dumb luck experimentation than you would from a program. So
thank you.
Yeah.
So we have time for just one last question in our final 2 minutes here. And Aly, this is a question I wonder about if you had it to do all over again, what would you do differently?
Ooh, such a good question. I mean, we're doing pretty well. So like overall, I would say I'm like relatively happy with the things that we've done so far. I feel like, this is going to sound so crazy, one thing that comes to mind is I think there's like a sweet spot for doing accelerator programs. In some ways, we're actually past that sweet spot now. We would be too late stage for a lot of programs and not get as much value out of it. Heck, I think that there were periods where we could have done even more programs. And again, because it's such an easy source of funding and you do learn and expand your network, heck, there are times where I wish maybe we'd been applying even more proactively to programs. And so I don't, I know that it sounds like a lot to have done 6 programs. I actually have 0 regrets about every single program I've done. I feel like we really got a lot of value out of it. It was 100% worth the time and energy. So that's one thing I would call out. And then I think being said, being intentional about what you want to get out of it. And I think the place where people who go through accelerator programs fail the most is really actually taking advantage of the network and the connections. And so that's something you really want to have a game plan for. And that was something that in our early accelerator programs, we didn't. So that's where I see most people mess up.
What a great answer. That's great. I'm so happy for you and how far you've come with your organization. And I'm so excited for what you're doing with your organization. I think you really have a chance to change the face of how math is done. And it's amazing. And thank you so much for sharing your experience about accelerators. Thank you to everyone here for being here and also for sharing your questions. And we look forward to seeing you at the next event. If you have any questions about this event, or if you'd like to see the recording, feel free to email me at janessa@thelearningagency.com. And thank you all for being here.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for organizing it.